On August 23, 1972, a 20-year-old woman from Bothell, Washington, borrowed her younger sister's waffle stomper boots, got onto a white 10-speed bicycle, and started riding toward the horse stable where she kept her horse. The stable was about 6 miles northeast of her family's home. It was a bright summer afternoon, and for the first time, she chose the bike instead of the car. She never reached the stable. For more than 3 decades, one tiny stain on the outside of the left boot sat unnoticed. Investigators from different agencies handled the boot, examined it, stored it, moved it, and reviewed the evidence again and again. Nobody saw it. Then, in 2008, a state crime lab technician finally found what everyone else had missed. That stain contained the DNA of the man who had killed her. Her name was Jody Loomis. She was 20 years old and lived with her parents, her fiancé Jim Roberts, and her 12-year-old sister Jana at 20 Winesap Road in unincorporated Snohomish County. Today, that area is part of Mill Creek, but back in 1972, it was much more rural. There were dirt roads, wooded properties, horse stables, open land, and long stretches where a person could travel without seeing anyone else. Jody had a horse named Saudi at a stable on Strum Road, around 6 miles from her home. She loved riding and usually drove there. But on that day, August 23rd, she made a different choice. She borrowed Jana's waffle stomper boots, left home at around 5 in the evening, and began riding along Penny Creek Road while the daylight was still strong. The route took her through quiet dirt roads and wooded areas where traffic was rare. Somewhere near the middle of that ride, a dirt track branched away from Penny Creek Road and disappeared into thick forest. That dirt track became the place where Jody's life ended. At about 5:30 that evening, a young couple drove up that same dirt track. They had gone there to do some target shooting in the woods. They expected to shoot at cans. Instead, they found a young woman lying on the ground. She was mostly unclothed. She had been sexually assaulted. She had a gunshot wound above her right ear from a .22 caliber pistol. She was still breathing, but she was unresponsive. The couple picked her up, carried her to their car, and drove her to Stevens Memorial Hospital in Edmonds, about 15 minutes away. They did not stop to cover her. They just drove as fast as they could with a dying woman in the back seat. When they arrived, Jody was pronounced dead. The names of the couple were never publicly released. Investigators began reconstructing what they believed had happened. Jody had likely been forced off the road at gunpoint and taken into the trees. She was sexually assaulted, and then she was shot while trying to dress herself. The gunshot wound was the injury that killed her. Her white 10-speed bicycle was found on the dirt track where she had been intercepted. Her clothing was collected from the scene. So were the waffle stomper boots she had borrowed from Jana earlier that afternoon. Everything was sealed and placed into evidence storage at the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office. In the days after the murder, deputies went through the area and questioned people. Several local men drew attention. One was a ranch owner who had reportedly behaved inappropriately toward Jody before, the kind of behavior neighbors had noticed but had not reported to police. Another was a tenant from a nearby property who had been chopping wood near the dirt track that afternoon and could not clearly explain his time. Deputies questioned both men, along with others in the area. But none of them could be tied to the crime by physical evidence, witness statements, fingerprints, or anything strong enough to hold. There were no witnesses to the attack itself. No fingerprints from the scene gave investigators a suspect. Nothing connected one specific person to what happened in the woods. By the end of 1972, the case had already gone cold. For Snohomish County, it became one of the most painful and frustrating kinds of cases. There was a crime scene. There was physical evidence. There was a young woman who had been murdered. But there was no lead that survived serious investigation. The evidence was placed into long-term storage. The case file was put away with other unsolved homicides. Detectives moved on to new work and new cases. But the Loomis family never moved on. Jana Loomis was only 12 years old when her older sister borrowed her boots and never came home. She grew up with that afternoon hanging over her life. She watched her parents carry a grief that time never really softened. For a long time after Jody's death, the family left her bedroom just as it had been. Jana later said that when you walked inside, you could still smell Jody's patchouli oil. Her leather purse remained where she had left it on the final day of her life. Jana said her parents hurt so much. That was what the family became after August 23, 1972. A daughter was gone. A bedroom stayed frozen. A case produced no answers. And the people who loved Jody were left with silence. Years passed. Jana went from 12 to 20, from 20 to 30, from 30 to 40. She graduated. She married. She became Jana Loomis Smith. Her parents aged through those same years, still carrying the same unanswered question. They called the sheriff's office asking for updates, but there were no updates to give. The file was still open, but it was not moving. Both of Jody's parents died without learning who had killed their daughter. They raised her, lost her on a summer afternoon, waited for justice for the rest of their lives, and died with the same question they had been asking since 1972. After her parents were gone, Jana became the family's voice. She continued calling detectives. She attended press conferences when the sheriff's office made new efforts to revive the case. She refused to let her sister become just another file in a cabinet. In 2008, when the case finally began to move again, Jana told reporters that she wanted the person responsible to sweat. She wanted him to know that someone was still watching. By then, she had been carrying her sister's case for 36 years, longer than Jody herself had been alive. She told reporters that the family missed Jody's love and her sisterhood. She said the pain had become part of their surviving life. And then she said it in the simplest way. Jody had her whole life ahead of her, and it was just taken away. Just taken away. And they lived with that every day. In 2005, cold case detective Jim Scharf of the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office pulled Jody's file from a shelf. By then, the case was 33 years old. It was the county's oldest unsolved homicide. Scharf was careful, steady, and persistent. He began by going back through the original evidence. He reviewed the reports. He re-examined the old leads. He tried to re-interview people where possible. Most importantly, he sent anything that might contain DNA to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab for modern testing. 3 years later, in 2008, a Washington State Patrol Crime Lab technician found something on the outside of Jody's left boot. It had been there since 1972. It was semen. It was a small stain, one that investigators from multiple agencies had missed for 36 years. The boot had remained in evidence storage at the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office the entire time. It had been collected, cataloged, preserved, handled, moved, reviewed, and stored across decades. And still, nobody had seen the stain until that technician examined it with modern equipment and under different lighting conditions. The technician was able to extract a partial DNA profile from the stain. That profile was submitted to CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. CODIS compares DNA profiles from crime scenes against profiles collected from convicted offenders. If the person who left DNA at a crime scene has been convicted of a qualifying offense and their DNA has been entered into the system, the database can flag a match. But if that person has never been added to the database, CODIS has nothing to compare against. In Jody's case, no match came back. The man who had killed her in 1972 was not in CODIS. That did not necessarily mean he had no criminal history. It only meant his DNA was not in the database. His offenses may have happened before mandatory DNA collection laws, or they may not have fallen into categories that required a sample. So the partial profile remained in the system. For the next 10 years, it continued being automatically compared against new profiles as people were convicted and added to the database. Year after year, nothing came back. Detective Scharf kept the case alive through all of it. He searched for new possibilities. He submitted the profile to new databases when they became available. He stayed in contact with Jana. Sometimes he called even when the only update was that there was nothing new. The file had already spent 33 years gathering dust before he reopened it, and he was determined not to let that happen again. Then, in July of 2018, Scharf tried a different path. He sent the DNA profile to Parabon Nanolabs, a private forensic company in Virginia known for using genetic genealogy. This method works very differently from CODIS. Instead of searching only convicted offender databases, genetic genealogy looks for biological relatives through public ancestry databases, such as GEDmatch, where ordinary people upload DNA results to research their family history. If someone in the database shares enough DNA with an unknown crime scene profile, that person may be a cousin or distant relative of the suspect. From there, genealogists can build family trees, trace branches through records, and slowly narrow the possibilities. Parabon brought in Deb Stone, a genetic genealogist based in Oregon. Her job was to take the distant DNA matches and work outward. She started with second and third cousins connected to the unknown male profile. Then she worked backward through generations, studying births, marriages, deaths, census files, court records, newspaper archives, and public family trees. Stone spent 57 hours on the project. Piece by piece, the branches began pointing toward a family in the Edmonds area of Snohomish County. But genealogy could only point investigators toward a family line. It could not prove which specific person in that family had left DNA on Jody's boot in 1972. Detectives still needed a direct DNA sample from the suspect. On August 28, 2018, law enforcement officers followed the man they had identified to the Tulip Casino north of Everett. They watched him buy a coffee. They watched him sit down at a machine. They watched him finish the drink and throw the cup into a garbage can. After he walked away, officers collected the cup. The cup was sent directly to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. In September of 2018, the lab confirmed what the genealogy had predicted. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the DNA from the semen found on Jody's left boot. The statistical probability of a coincidental match was 980 million to 1. After 46 years, after thousands of investigative hours, after evidence had sat in storage while one generation aged into another, a discarded coffee cup at a casino gave detectives the answer they had been chasing since 1972. Detective Scharf had worked the case for 14 years by that point. The coffee cup was the break he had been waiting for since 2005. The man who killed Jody Loomis had been living only 5 miles from the crime scene for 46 years. He had raised a family. He had worked. He had run a business. He had gone to casinos. He had grown old. And all that time, the evidence was sitting in a storage room, while the Loomis family buried both parents without ever knowing his name. His history had begun before Jody's murder. When he was 18, he married a 14-year-old girl. In 1968, for years before Jody was killed, he drove a company truck up to a teenage girl walking in Mount Lake Terrace, called her over, and exposed himself to her. During a police interview, he admitted what he had done and was cited for lewd conduct. In 1972, the year Jody was murdered, he was 33 years old and living in Edmonds with his third wife. He worked as a heavy equipment operator. His name never appeared in the original investigation. Deputies were focused on local men who knew Jody or had been seen near the dirt track that afternoon. He did not fit either category. He was never questioned. He was never interviewed. His name was not on any list in the case file. He lived 5 miles from the crime scene and stayed completely invisible to the investigators trying to solve the murder. After that, he married again. Around 1976, he married his 4th wife, Linda, and they remained together for more than 4 decades. They ran a ceramic shop from their garage called Miller's Cove. To neighbors and customers, he was Terry, the ceramics man, a retired heavy equipment operator living quietly in Edmonds. But court records showed another side. He had been accused of sex crimes at least 5 times over 3 decades after the 1968 lewd conduct citation. In the mid-1970s, accusations surfaced that he had molested a preteen. In 1990, 2 sisters reported that he had touched them, though they later said it might have been accidental and no charges were filed. In 1999, a man with developmental disabilities reported that Miller had sexually abused him, but prosecutors determined the incident was outside the statute of limitations. 5 known accusations across 30 years, and after the original lewd conduct citation, none resulted in a conviction. Detective Scharf, who had spent 14 years pursuing Jody's case by then, called him a real predator when the arrest was announced. His name was Terrence Miller. Most people called him Terry. He was 77 years old when deputies arrested him at his Edmonds home on April 11, 2019. He was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Jody Loomis. Bail was set at $1 million, and he posted it. Sheriff Ty Trenery held a press conference in Everett and credited the persistence of the cold case team, along with the power of new DNA technology. From murder to arrest, 47 years had passed. Miller pleaded not guilty at his arraignment and was released on bail while awaiting trial. The judge ordered him to surrender any weapons or firearms in his home and placed him under electronic home monitoring. He returned to the same Edmonds house where he had lived for decades, the same house with the ceramics shop in the garage. The trial was delayed for more than a year. Part of the delay came from the pandemic. Part came from defense motions challenging the DNA evidence. In October of 2020, a judge denied the defense's motion to suppress the genetic genealogy evidence. That ruling cleared the way for trial. Jury selection began in late October in Snohomish County Superior Court, with Judge David Kurtz presiding. The trial lasted 2 weeks and ran into early November. Prosecutors Craig Matheson and Bob Langman built their case around the DNA evidence and the chain that connected every piece. They began with the semen found on Jody's boot from the 1972 crime scene. They explained how a partial DNA profile was developed in 2008. Then they walked the jury through Parabon's analysis, Deb Stone's genealogy work in 2018, the casino surveillance, the discarded coffee cup, the crime lab confirmation, and the 980 million to 1 match. The defense attacked the case at every vulnerable point. Public defenders Laura Martin and Frederick Mall argued that almost 5 decades of evidence handling had created too many chances for contamination. Martin told the jury that the prosecution's entire case depended on what she described as a flawed DNA analysis from the outside of a boot. Mall focused on the details. Deputies at the 1972 autopsy had not worn gloves. Some evidence had been lost or unaccounted for during long periods between the murder and the first DNA testing. Under cross-examination, prosecution witnesses acknowledged that a Washington State Patrol Crime Lab analyst's DNA had appeared on a reference sample during testing. The defense argued that the boot may have been contaminated and that the evidence handling was so flawed that the jury could not trust what any lab found decades later. Jana also spoke in the courtroom. 48 years after her sister's murder, she stood before the jury and before the man accused of killing Jody. She said that for those who remained, all they had was the hope of justice and accountability for the hideous theft of Jody's life. She described what those decades had looked like for the family. In the more than 46 years since that day, she said the accused had celebrated birthdays, Christmases, and every holiday in between. He had married. He had raised children. He had continued living a full life. Meanwhile, her family had lived with an empty space that never closed. Closing arguments ended on Friday, November 6, 2020. The jury began deliberating that afternoon and then adjourned for the weekend. On Monday morning, November 9, 2020, Terrence Miller was found dead at his home in Edmonds. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The Snohomish County Medical Examiner confirmed the death as suicide. He was 78 years old. The jury did not know he was dead. That same Monday morning, jurors returned to court and continued deliberating. They reviewed the evidence. They considered the defense argument that decades of handling had compromised the DNA. They weighed the prosecution's claim that the chain of evidence still held. That afternoon, they reached a verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. 12 jurors, who had no idea the defendant had already taken his own life, looked at the DNA evidence, considered the contamination arguments, and decided the match was real. The semen on the boot belonged to Miller. The coffee cup confirmed it. He was the man who killed Jody Loomis in the woods off Penny Creek Road in August of 1972. And the evidence he left on her sister's boot was what finally proved it 48 years later. Detective Scharf said he was glad the family got to hear the verdict. He said it was good for them. It was the only thing the justice system still had left to give Jana and the surviving members of the Loomis family. There would be no sentencing, no prison term, no chance to watch the man who killed Jody spend the rest of his life behind bars. Miller had taken that from them too. His defense team filed a motion to vacate the conviction. Their argument was that because Miller died before the verdict was read in court, he had been denied his constitutional right to appeal, and therefore the conviction should be thrown out. Judge Kurtz held a hearing in December of 2020. He listened to family members from both sides. He listened to the attorneys. Then he denied the motion. He said it would not be the right thing to do to erase what the jury had found. The conviction stood. Jana was 12 years old when she lent her sister those waffle stomper boots on a sunny August afternoon. She was 60 when the jury said guilty. By then, both of her parents were gone. She heard the verdict without them. For nearly 5 decades, the family had lived with a question that seemed impossible to answer. Jody had gone out for a simple bike ride to see her horse and never came home. Her killer stayed hidden for 46 years. He built a life close to the place where he had ended hers. But one small stain remained. It survived the crime scene. It survived storage. It survived years of missed examinations, old technology, dead leads, and decades of silence. It waited on the outside of a boot borrowed from a 12-year-old sister. And when science finally caught up, that stain told the truth.